There was a time when almost everything around us carried the words "Made in China." From slippers and electric fans to toys, phones, laptops, and televisions, China seemed to exist in every corner of modern life. It felt as if the entire world was running on Chinese factories. But then the pandemic hit, supply chains collapsed, and the US-China trade war intensified. Suddenly, the world realized how dangerous it was to depend too heavily on a single country, and one massive question began to emerge. If China is the factory of the world today, who could replace it tomorrow? There was a period when nearly every object around us had some connection to China. Clothes, shoes, toys, smartphones, computers, fans, televisions, even tiny things like chargers and electrical plugs often came with the familiar label "Made in China." For many people growing up, that phrase became so common it almost felt like a natural part of modern life. Over the last 3 decades, China achieved something almost unprecedented in human history. It transformed itself into the manufacturing superpower of the planet. At one point, the country produced more than 30% of global industrial output. In other words, out of every 3 products made on Earth, roughly 1 had ties to China. In electronics, the dominance was even greater. From smartphones and laptops to advanced industrial components, China built an enormous manufacturing ecosystem that the world became deeply dependent on. But eventually, things began to change. The COVID-19 pandemic paralyzed global supply chains. Factories shut down, ports became overcrowded, shipping containers were stranded, and the entire world suddenly realized how risky it was to rely too heavily on a single country. Then came the escalating US-China trade war, which pushed many Western corporations to ask a new question. If the world needs another manufacturing hub, who could replace China? That question opened the door for several rising contenders. If there is one country many people believe has the greatest potential to rival China in manufacturing scale, it is India. The first reason is simple: population. India has already surpassed China as the world's most populous nation with more than 1.4 billion people. That is an enormous advantage in industrial production. To become the factory of the world, a country first needs a massive labor force. Some Indian cities have populations larger than entire European countries. The Delhi metropolitan area alone has more than 30 million residents. A single urban region contains more people than many developed nations. But India's greatest strength may not just be its population size, it is the age of that population. While many countries are rapidly aging, hundreds of millions of Indians are still within working age. In today's world, that is an extremely valuable asset. India also occupies a strategic geographic position. The country stretches deep into the Indian Ocean like a giant ship pointing toward global trade routes. If India continues developing its ports and infrastructure, it could become a major connector between the Middle East, Africa, Southeast Asia, and Europe. Another major advantage India possesses is English proficiency. Because of its colonial history under Britain, much of India's educated workforce, engineers, managers, and technology specialists, speaks English fluently. That makes cooperation with Western companies far easier. This is one reason why corporations like Apple and Foxconn have been moving increasing amounts of production to India. iPhones manufactured in India are becoming more common across global markets. However, India still faces major weaknesses, especially infrastructure. Some regions are highly modernized, but just a short distance away, roads may be crowded and underdeveloped, electricity can be unstable, logistics remain inefficient, and ports are often overloaded. China today resembles a fully optimized industrial machine, while India looks more like a giant that has only recently awakened, powerful, but still somewhat clumsy. The second major contender is Mexico. If India's advantage lies in population, Mexico's greatest strength is geography. It sits directly beside the United States. Goods shipped from China or India to America can take weeks by sea, but products manufactured in Mexico can cross the border by truck in a matter of hours or days. That makes Mexico extremely attractive to American companies. This trend is often called nearshoring, moving production closer to the consumer market instead of manufacturing on the other side of the planet. In reality, Mexico has already been an industrial power for decades, especially in the automotive sector. Companies like Ford, General Motors, BMW, Toyota, and Kia all operate massive factories there. Many cities in northern Mexico are economically built around exporting products to the U.S. market. Mexico has a population of more than 130 million people, a relatively young workforce, and labor costs much lower than the United States. However, the country also struggles with serious problems such as organized crime, cartel violence, economic inequality, and heavy dependence on the American economy. As a result, Mexico is highly effective as a manufacturing hub for North America, but it may not become a truly global industrial center like China. Then there is Indonesia. Indonesia is fascinating because its biggest advantage lies not only in its people, but beneath the ground itself. The country possesses some of the world's largest nickel reserves. In the age of electric vehicles, nickel is almost as important to EV batteries as oil once was to gasoline-powered cars. That has turned Indonesia into a major target for international investment. Companies from China, South Korea, and elsewhere have poured billions into building nickel refineries, battery factories, and EV supply chains across the country. Indonesia also has another major strength population. With around 280 million people, it is the largest country in Southeast Asia. That creates both a huge labor force and a massive domestic consumer market. Geographically, Indonesia sits along some of the busiest maritime trade routes on Earth, connecting the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean. But Indonesia's geography is also one of its weaknesses. As an archipelago made up of thousands of islands, transportation and logistics become far more expensive and complicated than in more geographically unified countries. Another contender is Bangladesh. Bangladesh demonstrates how population density can become industrial strength. The country has more than 170 million people packed into a relatively small area. Today, Bangladesh is one of the world's largest garment manufacturing centers. A huge amount of global clothing production takes place there. Its advantages are straightforward: cheap labor, a massive workforce, and strong specialization in textile exports. However, Bangladesh remains heavily concentrated in low-cost manufacturing industries. Moving into advanced sectors like electronics or semiconductors is still a distant goal. And finally, there is Vietnam. Over the past decade, Vietnam has risen rapidly within global supply chains. Major corporations such as Samsung, LG, Intel, Foxconn, Lego, and Apple suppliers have all expanded operations there. Interestingly, Vietnam's biggest advantage may actually be its proximity to China. That might sound surprising, but it is incredibly important. The world's largest industrial supply chain ecosystem still exists around southern China, especially regions like Guangdong and Shenzhen. Vietnam sits directly beside that industrial heartland. Components, machinery, and raw materials can move quickly by land, rail, or sea. In many ways, Vietnam is not fully replacing China. It is becoming an extension of Asia's broader manufacturing ecosystem. Vietnam also has more than 3,000 kilometers of coastline, a huge advantage for maritime trade. Ports such as Hai Phong and Kai Mep Thi Vai are becoming increasingly important in global logistics networks. The country now has more than 100 million people, and Vietnamese workers are often praised for learning quickly, working hard, and adapting efficiently. Samsung once turned Vietnam into its largest smartphone production base in the world, exporting tens of billions of dollars worth of products annually. Still, Vietnam has limitations. A population of 100 million is large by Southeast Asian standards, but still far smaller than China or India. Vietnam is also currently stronger in assembly manufacturing than in controlling core technologies. Many critical components and materials still need to be imported, and the more people talk about replacing China, the more they realize just how difficult that task truly is, because China's greatest strength today is no longer cheap labor. It is the enormous industrial ecosystem built over decades. If a Chinese factory suddenly needs thousands of specialized screws, suppliers can often deliver them within hours. In many other countries, companies might need to wait weeks for imports. China possesses some of the largest ports in the world, an enormous high-speed transportation network, millions of engineers, tens of millions of skilled workers, and one of the densest supply chain systems ever created. That is why replacing China completely may be nearly impossible for any single nation. The future may not belong to one dominant factory of the world. Instead, manufacturing could become distributed across multiple industrial centers. India may dominate in labor scale in domestic markets. Mexico may specialize in supplying North America. Indonesia could become a battery and resource powerhouse. Bangladesh may continue leading in low-cost garments. Vietnam may strengthen its role in electronics and export manufacturing. Meanwhile, China will likely remain dominant in advanced technology, industrial ecosystems, and large-scale production. The world may be entering an era of multi-factory globalization, where no single nation manufactures everything, but many countries share different roles inside one massive global production machine. And in that future, Vietnam will almost certainly play an increasingly important role.